is a lecture about the autonomic nervous system. This lecture is based on Martini's chapter 17. Here are the learning objectives. Here is drawing assignment 1, the sympathetic and parasympathetic motor neurons, and drawing assignment 2, a comparison of the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. Okay, the somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. The central and peripheral nervous systems include the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. This is one of the first slides that we looked at when we started the neuro block, and here we see somatic sensory receptors and visceral sensory receptors, and then they ascend up into the central nervous system, and then there is information processing, and the central nervous system decides whether a motor command is needed, and if it is, commands to the somatic nervous system go down one arm to skeletal muscles, whereas the autonomic nervous system goes to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, and adipose tissue. Both systems have sensory receptors and sensory nerves. Both receive conscious and subconscious sensory information. The somatic nervous system sends voluntary and involuntary motor commands to skeletal muscle. It is the voluntary motor commands that are unique to the somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system sends involuntary motor commands to effector organs, cardiac and smooth muscle, glands, and adipose tissue. The autonomic nervous system monitors and adjusts the cardiovascular, respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive system functions, and also body temperature as needed. The autonomic nervous system is active both while we are asleep and while we are awake. And here in slide 11, we see the other diagram from Martini's that we saw in our first lecture about the nervous system, showing us that there are receptors that bring in information from the peripheral nervous system. The information, either visceral sensory neurons or somatic sensory neurons. It then is carried into the central nervous system, where interneurons process it, and then it flows out of the central nervous system either on somatic motor neurons that go to skeletal muscle or visceral motor neurons that go to smooth muscle, glands, cardiac muscle, and adipose tissue. In both systems, the spinal cord and brain process sensory input and initiate motor responses. An important difference between the two systems is where the motor commands are initiated. In the somatic nervous system, many motor commands are initiated in the cerebral motor cortex. In the autonomic nervous system, many motor commands are initiated in the hypothalamus. And here's just a little chart showing you the somatic nervous system and the cerebral cortex, where the motor commands come from. We learned that the primary motor cortex is just anterior to the central sulcus. And then we have a picture of the autonomic nervous system associated with the hypothalamus, with the picture showing that the hypothalamus has many nuclei and is located in the diencephalon. And here's just a picture of a tissue specimen showing the hypothalamus and what it looks like, which is actually like nothing much. It's just a little spot there, but we know that superiorly there's the thalamus, anteriorly there's the optic chiasm. The mammillary bodies, which are part of the hypothalamus, are also visible in this picture. Unfortunately, the pituitary stalk is cut in this picture, and therefore we can't use the pituitary as a landmark, because the pituitary is a terrific landmark. Finally, as we get towards the posterior behind the mammillary bodies, we have reached the midbrain. So you can look at all those landmarks to find the borders of the hypothalamus. Okay, the hypothalamus receives sensory input from almost every structure in the central nervous system and also from structures and fluids that are not even in the central nervous system. So a list would be the spinal cord, brainstem, thalamus, cerebral cortex, limbic system, cerebrospinal fluid, interstitial fluid in the central nervous system, and even the blood. All of these inputs influence the output of the hypothalamus to the autonomic nervous system. There are specific nuclei in the hypothalamus that control the autonomic nervous system. In general, the hypothalamus controls autonomic functions, sets appetite and drive, such as thirst, hunger, and sex drives and their associated behaviors, sets emotional states along with the limbic system, and controls the endocrine system along with the pituitary gland. There are some notable nuclei that control autonomic nervous system functions. We have the preoptic area, which regulates body temperature via control of autonomic centers in the medulla. Then we have other areas just described as autonomic centers, both sympathetic and parasympathetic, and they control heart rate and blood pressure via regulation of autonomic nervous system centers in the medulla. The mammillary bodies control feeding reflexes like licking and swallowing. So breastfeeding, because mammillary bodies were thought to look like breasts, and then, feeding is what feeding reflexes are associated with them. So maybe that will help you remember. There are visceral motor nuclei in the hypothalamus that synapse on the autonomic motor nuclei in the brainstem and spinal cord. In the spinal cord, the motor nuclei sending commands to the peripheral somatic and autonomic nervous systems are separate, as we learned in the spinal cord lecture. The autonomic motor nuclei are in the lateral horn, posterior to the somatic motor nuclei, and just anterior actually to the visceral sensory nuclei, which themselves are anterior to the somatic sensory nuclei. So everything has its proper place. It's all highly organized. So to follow through the somatic and autonomic nervous system pathways, the somatic nervous system goes from the cerebral cortex to anterior horn motor nuclei to skeletal muscle. The autonomic nervous system has commands initiated at the hypothalamus that then travel to the lateral horn motor nuclei, then to autonomic ganglia, then to cardiac and smooth muscle glands and adipocytes. And here is a slide that summarizes the somatic nervous system in the top panel and the autonomic nervous system in the bottom panel. It's actually a very nice slide that gives a tremendous amount of information and is easy to read. Okay, the overall organization of the autonomic nervous system is that there are three subsets of motor neurons: the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, and the enteric nervous system. The last system is sometimes considered part of the autonomic nervous system and is sometimes considered an independent system or a part of the digestive system. In the somatic nervous system, the lower motor neuron axons travel all the way to skeletal muscle fibers. As we learned, motor commands come from the primary motor cortex, where there is the cell body of an upper motor neuron. And that cell body has an axon that travels all the way down to the motor nuclei, the somatic motor nuclei, in the spinal cord, where it synapses on a lower motor neuron. And then the lower motor neuron goes all the way from the anterior horn to the skeletal muscle. In the autonomic nervous system, there's a chain of two motor neurons that travel to the target tissue, starting at the level of the spinal cord. Okay. So we're going to break that down. The first motor neuron is called the preganglionic neuron. It's in the spinal cord or in the brainstem for cranial nerves. The axon of the preganglionic neuron travels to a ganglion. The motor neurons in the ganglion are called ganglionic neurons. The preganglionic neurons synapse on the ganglionic neurons. Then the ganglionic neurons send an axon to the target tissue, and this axon is called a postganglionic axon or fiber sometimes. The axon may be long or short. So, to summarize, preganglionic neurons in the brain stem or spinal cord synapse with ganglionic neurons in peripheral ganglion. Postganglionic axons synapse on effector organs or target tissues. Okay,